Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. Tomorrow, the Prime Minister starts a 7-day, 5-nation trip which will take him to Afghanistan, Qatar, Switzerland, the United States and Mexico. It's a major visit that covers several key strategic ambitions. Today, on the eve of his departure, we ask, what are the Prime Minister's principal targets? How likely is he to succeed? And most importantly, can he win sufficient support for India's admission to the NSG? And will he sign major agreements with the United States, as Ram Madhav revealed to this program on Wednesday? My guests are India's former ambassador to Afghanistan and a key expert on disarmament, Rakesh Sood, India's former ambassador to the United States, Meera Shankar, the foreign editor of the Hindustan Times, Pramitpal Chaudhary, who will be joining us shortly, the director of Carnegie India, C. Raja Mohan, and the former Director General of the Delhi Policy Group, Radha Kumar. Rakesh, so the Prime Minister will begin his 5-nation trip tomorrow with a visit to Herat in Afghanistan to inaugurate the Salma Dam, which India has built at a cost of $275 million. Now, you're a former ambassador to Afghanistan. Can you explain why this is a critical strategic achievement which requires the Prime Minister's personal presence?
Well, first of all, it is one of the major infrastructure projects that we have taken up. And this is in fact last of the major infrastructure projects which was pending. You know, the Prime Minister was there in December for inauguration of the Parliament. And the other major infrastructure projects like the big road, Zaransh Delaram, the power transmission line which brings electricity to Kabul, all of these have been completed. Salma was the one that was still pending. And because it has been delayed quite a lot, it was important that we complete it. And also, it provides Prime Minister Modi another opportunity to have, this would be his 3rd meeting in the last 6 months, because after December, President Ashraf Ghani was also there in Tehran. And now again, they will have a meeting to look at what the evolving situation in Afghanistan is.
Now, Professor Raja Mohan, the Salma Dam links up with India's involvement in the Chabahar port project. And beyond that, it's part of India's long-established desire to establish connections to Central Asia. But to what extent is all of this vulnerable, first by opposition from Pakistan, and secondly, by physical attacks by the Taliban, both of which could increase as US and NATO troop numbers start to sharply come down?
So I think the security in Afghanistan is the big question. I mean, I think the American troop involvement, presence has come down to around 10,000. Taliban is on an offensive. So my sense is how the US is going to deal with it. The current administration, I don't think is going to do anything new except that they've attacked Mullah Muhammad Mansour of Taliban. So I think things could change. But the key is the question of security. Without security, nothing, no development is going to take place. My sense is, will the US begin to change its strategy and is willing to think of how to deal with Pakistan and Taliban differently, then I think we are seeing something quite significant. But if the same thing continues, then I think the problems are going to multiply.
So in a sense, the Prime Minister is ensuring against a bad outcome if the US doesn't start changing its thinking.
No. Damn, look, we put in our money in there. I mean, I think you had to complete it. Even the Parliament building is even more vulnerable. That doesn't mean you stop. Look, I think we had to do what we had to do. Now, how we deal with the new situation, that is something completely new.
Now, Pramitpal Chaudhary, after Afghanistan, the Prime Minister is going to go to Qatar. This is the 3rd Arab country he's visiting after the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Is seeking Qatari investments, particularly for India's infrastructure, one of the prime focuses of his visit?
Qatar is the single largest source of imported natural gas that we have in this country. 98% of our natural gas that we import comes from this single country. So for us, Qatar is an obvious partner, and for them, we are an obvious client. At a time when the world is flooded with natural gas, you're seeing countries like the United Arab Emirates, an oil exporter, Saudi Arabia, obviously the world's largest swing producer, and a natural gas producer like Qatar, trying to secure future clients. So the United States is off the market because they're a net exporter now. China's economy is slowing down. We are now number 3. So we are now turning, and our game is, can we leverage this relationship into one of rather than just being a buyer, and to say that, okay, if you want us to buy your stuff, then do something on our side, which is, for example, build our infrastructure. We import natural gas, but we have a pathetic natural gas infrastructure. We have no national grid. We have we have a limited number of LNG plants. So we're telling Qatar, you invest in this. As we've told the UAE, we've told the United Arab Emirates, all right, you have a huge sovereign wealth fund, one of the biggest in the world. You want a closer relationship with us? Put your money where your mouth is. So they've said, we'll put $45 billion into India. Saudi Arabia has also said that once they raise their $1 trillion from selling 5% of Aramco, they will do the same thing.
Now, Radha Kumar, the Prime Minister is also, as it happens, very keen on a good relationship with Israel. He's going to be visiting Israel either later this year or perhaps more likely early next year. And there's no doubt that he wants a closer relationship with Tel Aviv than any of his predecessors. Will that complicate whatever he's trying to do with Arab countries like Qatar, like the UAE and Saudi Arabia? Because it's a difficult, if not awkward, balancing act. Radha Kumar, did you hear that question? No, clearly she didn't. Can I put that to you?
Yeah, sure. The question was...
will the Prime Minister's attempt to forge closer relations with Israel, something that he's very keen on, complicate whatever he's trying to do with the Arabs?
Well, I think if you see, he's visited Saudi Arabia, he has visited Iran, and we've also kept alive our links with the Palestinians and our stand on the Palestine issue. Now, if you look at some of the countries themselves, Saudi Arabia, or UAE, many of them have been working with Israel to isolate Iran. So the dynamics of the region is not so black and white, as sometimes it's presumed to be. I think
in other words, it's not such a difficult tightrope for him to walk.
Well, we've been balancing opposing factions in West Asia and the Middle East, whether it's Saudi Arabia or Iran, or Israel and Iran, or Israel and Palestine, Israel and the Arab world. And I think India's interests are so complex that we would have to continue to do this.
Do you believe Mr. Modi has a particular flair in balancing these sort of awkward relationships? Because no Indian Prime Minister before has sought in one term to visit Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, and then within 6 months, Israel. And no Indian Prime Minister has attempted to be as close to Benjamin Netanyahu as he is to, say, King Suleiman or the Saudis or to the UAE. So it's a difficult one.
Partly this challenge of balancing only emerged after we established diplomatic relations with Israel. But today there are two factors that create difficulties. One is, of course, the nuclear agreement which Iran signed with P5+1, which led to a certain amount of anxieties both in Israel as well as in the Arab states, particularly Saudi Arabia. The second is the increasing Shia-Sunni sectarian polarization that is taking place in the Arab world. And this is Arab versus Iranian also in some ways. And we see that manifested both in Syria as well as in Yemen today. So in that sense, the fact that Prime Minister has been to Saudi Arabia, UAE, and now will go to Qatar, and has also been to Iran, makes it easier for him to reach out also and complete the long-awaited visit to Israel.
Now, Radha Kumar, after Qatar, the Prime Minister is heading to Switzerland, and the Swiss visit, much like the visit that will follow subsequently to Mexico, is designed to get support for India's membership of the NSG. Today's Indian Express says, and I'm quoting, these two countries have expressed strong reservations on India's application. What can the PM say to overcome their concerns?
Well, I think he can repeat what he has said and what previous government people have said, which is that India's track record on nuclear safety, on non-proliferation, and on a series of issues associated with those points is a very good one, and that was the reason why the exemption for the civil nuclear agreement was given in the first place.
But will that work with the Swiss and the Mexicans?
That, I'm afraid, I have little reason to believe that it will. I think it's unlikely to work, and if you recall, Mexico is also part of the coffee club that opposes the kinds of UN reform, limited expansion that India supports.
Let me put it like this, and I put that to you, Professor Rajamor. The real stumbling block, and perhaps that's the reason why the Swiss and the Mexicans are important, is China. In 2008, China was equally a check to India's ambition at that point to get an NSG waiver to facilitate the Indo-US nuclear deal. At that point, George Bush, who was president, actually had to pick up the phone and phone Hu Jintao, who was then Chinese president, and lean on him. Do you think something similar will be necessary this time to break the Chinese deadlock? And when the Chinese deadlock goes, the Swiss and the Mexicans will diminish.
See, as you said, look, finally it's political. I mean, the technical arguments can always be used to say no, but my sense is it is political one. There are two parts to it. Now, do we reach out to, say, for example, our President Mukherjee went to China telling them, look, there is a political relationship here. Do you want to undermine it by doing what you're doing, or take the relationship in a different direction? I don't know whether they bought into it or not. Similarly with the Americans. The Americans have to do the heavy lifting. We have to do some, they'll have to do some. My sense is one of the things that is going to take up when Prime Minister Modi is in Washington is how we do it. My sense is the President will pick up the phone and talk to Xi Jinping. Our Prime Minister is going to be in Mexico and other countries. He's already, I believe today, Economic Times reports that he's calling a lot of other heads of government to call in your
Apparently he spent 2 days doing just that, ringing up all the 48 members of the NSG one by one to put pressure. But you know, ringing them up doesn't mean they'll deliver.
Look, in the end, is the pressure, how much pressure can you bring to bear on them? US can bend some, we'll have to bend some.
Let me ask you this, because I think it's a critical question, and I'm going to put it to both of you, and let me start with you, Mr. Soop. Will Barack Obama make the effort that George Bush made? George Bush Jr. was very keen to help India. He went out of his way to do so. Has Barack Obama got the same relationship? Does he see India as critical to his view of the world as George Bush did? Because that's what it all hinges on.
Well, one thing is certainly clear. Prime Minister Modi has invested a lot in building up a personal relationship. His first visit when he went there in 2014, the return visit, Republic Day chief guest, the Chai Pe Charcha at Hyderabad House, and then again the third meeting, and now fourth. And in between, of course, they have had many exchanges at multilateral settings, the climate change talks at Paris. So there is a certain investment. Second, Barack Obama is now in the last stages. I mean, this is his legacy kind of a thing. So we see the Iran nuclear deal, we see the Cuba deal. All of these are part of the legacy. This is also, in a sense, that delivery time. And therefore, you have a very strong prospect of President Obama in a very, not in the same emotive sense as President Bush, but in a much more objective sense, in a more cold-blooded sense, engaging with the other leaders who are the holdouts on the NSG, knowing that this is crunch time.
A lot of the hope that India has that Obama will pick up the phone and speak to Xi Jinping and put pressure rests on the fact that Mr. Modi has invested in Obama. Bringing him to India as chief guest on Republic Day was the greatest element of that, but there's a personal friendship that they've also developed. But do personal friendships lead to American presidents delivering when the other side needs it? Will that make the critical difference?
Well, let me put it like this. If we look back at 2008 and the NSG waiver, there were a lot of small countries who have a strong, non-proliferation profile who were opposing the waiver for India. And between India and the US and Germany, where I was ambassador and which was the chair of the NSG at the time, we managed to talk to all of them, and eventually in fact, all the other countries fell in line, with China finally being isolated as the only country which was opposing the waiver for India.
At the moment, China is not isolated.
And that is when President Bush picked up the phone and talked to the Chinese. So I would imagine that if we can convince the other members of the NSG along with the US to not oppose India's entry into the NSG, then China is more likely to agree, because they don't like to be isolated on such a major issue.
The interesting thing about that analysis, Pramit Pal Chaudhary, is that this means the Prime Minister's visit to Switzerland and Mexico becomes even more important, because it's only when he's whittled away their opposition that the Chinese will become susceptible to a phone call from Obama, assuming that phone call happens. How likely is the Prime Minister to persuade the Swiss and the Mexicans?
Well, the game is in my view, the non-proliferation issue is only is not all that important for the Swiss or the Mexicans. For them, the real issue is what do we get in return from India. Now, the Mexicans, to be fair, are actually interested in, and have been wooing India for a while. Their foreign minister came a few months ago, and they have been, in fact, two of their foreign ministers have come to India in the past 1.5 years, and in fact, I have met both of them. And what struck me for them was that they basically said that, look, you guys spend your entire time in Latin America focused only on one country, which is Brazil. But we are almost as big as Brazil economically, and in fact doing much better right now than they are. Why don't you take a look at us? So for them, the real issue has been that you've never bothered to pay any attention, even though we are actually the #2 economy of Latin America, and as I said, not too far behind the Brazilians. So, and they basically said, we are the manufacturing hub of Latin America.
So it's a quid pro quo they are seeking. Pay more attention to us, we'll stop objecting to your NSG waiver.
They have a whole bunch of things that they've been asking India to do. So it's quite possible for Modi to go in there and say, okay, look, I agree, we neglected you, and we're prepared to do this now.
What about the Swiss?
The Swiss, to be fair, I think their main thing has been basically, will you stop harassing us about this black money nonsense? Because we in Switzerland are no longer part of that game. This has moved on to Cayman Islands, but I know when I've met Swiss ambassadors...
But can I interrupt, Pramit? That's more difficult for the Prime Minister to agree to, assuming that is the quid pro quo the Swiss are looking for, because black money is a commitment which has enormous emotional appeal, and it would be difficult for him to look as if he's backing off it.
Well, he doesn't have to back off. He just has to accept that the Swiss have actually done something on that. That the Swiss have said, look, if you go through our records, we are now at best a white tax haven under OECD rules. We fulfill the international obligations for transparency. Our banks, the 1970s is gone as far as Switzerland is concerned. Will you at least accept that? Until now, India has basically said, oh, it's Switzerland, you're bad. And so the Swiss have kept coming back and saying, tell us what exactly we're doing.
All right. I think I've understood what you're saying, that in fact there is a possibility of Mr. Modi getting both the Swiss and the Mexicans to drop their objections, such as they are to India's membership of the NSG, because they're looking for a transactional relationship. A quid pro quo from our side that suits their interests will deliver what we want from them. In which case, let me broaden this canvas a little rather and put this to you. This is, as you heard Ambassador Sood point out, the Prime Minister's 4th meeting at summit level with President Obama in the last 2 years. Are we witnessing a transformation in India-US relations that Obama and Modi have together engineered?
Yes, there has been a transformation, but I would argue that that transformation has took place over the past 15 years. Having said that, I think that Prime Minister Modi's style of diplomacy is a very welcome one. He gives the impression of a man in a hurry, which is rather unusual for India, and no doubt a very welcome departure for the rest of the world, which I'm afraid we still have a big implementation problem. I hope that we can manage to speed up that process.
Professor Rajamon, on Wednesday, Ram Madhav, the General Secretary of the BJP, while speaking to me, said that the American visit would be a big bang. And that's the precise phrase he used. He then went on to reveal that there would be major agreements. And again, those were his exact words. Have you heard anything about this?
Look, I think knowing the Indian diplomacy, you have two of them sitting here. I mean, nothing comes together till the last minute. I mean, I think quite clearly they've been engaged in a
That also sounds like a polite way of saying there could always be a slip between the cup and the lip. But hopes can be dashed at the last
that's
moment.
That's what we love, walking on the ledge. And I think, but my sense is, look, on a visit like this, something will happen. Now the question is how big they are, we don't know. There is the LSA or the LEMOA as they call it now. Will it be done before time? Will there be an agreement on Westinghouse's finally buying those 6, constructing those 6 reactors? There is going to be something on climate change, climate finance. I think that's a major thing. Our media is not paying attention to it.
And the Hindu mentions a Predator drone deal as a possibility as well.
So that's on the DTTI. So I look, these guys cook up a lot of stuff. I mean, you know, at the end of every visit, they can produce 20 agreements. Now, we got to see how many of them are really a transformation. A Westinghouse deal would demonstrate finally the fruits of the nuclear initiative.
Yeah, but is it going to happen?
I think we're close to it.
That's the question. I mean, there are a lot of deals that could happen. There are several more that we hope will happen. But that's all in the realm of possibility. I'm talking about probability and likelihood. Is there anything big that's likely to happen? Or was Mr. Ram Madhav exaggerating and simply building up expectation without delivery?
Well, I think you've had one agreement apparently just before the visit on exchange of terrorist information with regard to individuals.
The one signed yesterday.
Yes, the one signed yesterday. And perhaps the LIMOA could be finalized because in principle both sides had agreed to do it. There was a text and it's a question of dotting the I's and crossing the T's. Whether there will be something on climate finance, whether there will be something in the field of defense. From what we've been told, the focus of this visit will be on two areas, defense and trade. Now on trade, will there be, something regarding India's membership of APEC? One has to see. Again, on defense, will there be some forward movement on some of the more
you're giving me, you're virtually giving me a Dhobi list of what could happen.
Yeah.
But I want you to tell me what do you think will happen, or is that impossible to say?
At this stage, it's difficult to say. But
So when Professor Raja Mohan says something will happen, that something could simply be exchanging pleasantries over dinner or lunch, shaking hands, renewing the friendship, and then the Prime Minister comes back.
I think LIMOA is a possibility. Certainly, when you're asking about possibilities, I would say LIMOA is a possibility.
Not a probability, just a possibility?
Possibility, probability also. I mean, when I say possible, I mean that it is likely.
It seems to me that the highlight of this visit, therefore, is going to be the Prime Minister talking to the joint houses of the American Congress.
Well, that is certainly a big honor, and that will be a very closely watched speech, no doubt about it, both within Washington and also here. But I do think that the other major item, which we will not hear very much about because we will see the results, that is the NSG membership. Now that's not something that's obviously there on the minds of both the leaders.
Is that perhaps the real reason why the Prime Minister has chosen to go? Because sitting face to face with Obama, with the extraordinary NSG meeting happening on the 9th, 10th, and then the actual plenary at the end of June, he can say to him, look, I need your help, I need you to pick up that phone, I need you to make that extra effort. And it's easier to do it face to face than if he's in Delhi.
Well, I mean, I can't sort of look inside the Prime Minister's head and figure out, but I do think that he does believe a lot in personal diplomacy. If you recall, when he was here, when President Obama was here on that Republic Day as the chief guest, there was this long conversation that the two leaders had
in the gardens of Hyderabad House
on discussing liability, and then they came out and then they announced that they had sorted out matters. The delegations had been sort of grappling with the fine detail, but then the two leaders announced that the problem had been sorted out and had been resolved. So therefore, the proof of that may also happen in terms of the Westinghouse agreement.
So would you say, Mrs. Shankar, that a concrete arrangement whereby the President picks up a phone and whittles down the opposition to NSG would be a great outcome? On top of that, the defense agreements would be beautiful. But if neither of those happen, would it then look disappointing?
I don't think so. I think it's part of a momentum and part of a process which is not going to come to a halt. I think the good thing...
So don't look for outcomes, look for the process continuing.
I think the outcomes will be there. If they happen, that's good. But I don't think you write off the relationship because it's more important. And the other thing I would say is that looking into the presidential election, India is well placed because both Republicans and Democrats want to strengthen the relationship with India. So you are at that fortunate position that there is a bipartisan consensus.
We've always been in that fortunate position. I can't recall a time when both American parties didn't want to strengthen the relationship. This has been the case for the last 15 years, if not more.
Yes.
So we can't make this a great virtue because it's a continuing one.
Well, it varies because I think the feeling in India at some points of time has been that the Republicans have been good for us, the Democrats have been more committed to issues of non-proliferation.
The Clinton presidency laid that to rest, and the Clinton presidency precedes Bush. So let's not get into that. But I want to bring up with you, Pramit, the fact that, as Mrs. Shankar says, we are 7 months away from a change. But I don't believe Mr. Modi on this visit will be meeting either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. Now, is that a bit of a shame, particularly in the case that he's not meeting Donald Trump, who knows could end up as president, or does it simply not matter?
Normally you don't meet, neither of the candidates are finalized, remember that. So he would actually then have to also meet Bernie Sanders, for example, which would make it difficult. So if he had gone after the July convention, possibly. But now it'll be a little awkward for him to attend without that being clear who the candidates are, at least officially. But that doesn't matter. He is meeting the heads of the Democratic and Republican leadership in the Congress, or the four people who will actually get legislation passed. I think for him the game is, or for the Indian side, is that, this is really the last month Obama can operate. After July, nobody will be paying any attention to him. A large portions of his administration staff will just resign and go off on holiday and never come back. And then the new administration that comes in, even if it's Hillary Clinton, will take about 6 months to get into place. And if it's Trump, who knows how long it could take. It could take another year before he gets into his place, because he has absolutely no staff. So you're looking at an America that effectively stops functioning for at least a year after next month. So
Okay.
if I'm Modi, even if I don't actually have anything completely finalized, I have a whole set of lot of little things that are the NSG, the Paris Climate Change Agreement, the APEC Summit, which is in December, MTCR, the Missile Technology Control Regime, the bilateral investment treaty with the United States, all of which I want to get as many of these done now, because if I don't get them done now, I'm going to have to wait almost possibly another month.
Absolutely. As you're saying, this is a little bit of a now or never moment for President Obama and Prime Minister Modi. Let's widen our discussion, Mr. Sood. Mr. Modi has done a lot of traveling. By one account, he's visited 40 countries, and I'm not including the 5 that he's about to visit starting tomorrow. And this compares to just 18 visited by Dr. Manmohan Singh in his first 2 years. But my question is, are the results commensurate with the enormous effort the Prime Minister's put in?
Well, first is, I think there is an enormous amount of continuity in what Prime Minister Modi is doing in terms of carrying forward the agenda. But also he has packaged it very effectively, and he has put in he's put in 2 new factors. One is a strong element of personal diplomacy, which I spoke about earlier. And the second is very good packaging, in the sense neighborhood first, and there is a focus on neighborhood. Indian Ocean, and there is a focus on Indian Ocean. The West Asian diplomacy, and you see there is a combination. So you can actually do little sections. Then of course with all the key leaders, whether in the neighboring countries or in the major powers, including whether it's President Obama or President Xi, or whether it's Prime Minister Abe, he has tried to, or Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, he has tried to build a personal kind of a diplomatic relationship which should help.
And succeeded in many instances.
And succeeded in many instances. So the second thing that he's done is, he's also done a lot of effort in wooing the diaspora. I mean, we've seen these big events taking place in Madison Square Garden, Wembley, etc., etc.
So can I interrupt at this point? Does this mean that in fact the results are commensurate with the effort?
Well, the results in many of these things will always take time in showing up. And I think we are just seeing the beginnings of this effort. The results, let's see, if the NSG happens, I think it would be, he can legitimately take credit for having invigorated a relationship with President Obama, and that having delivered.
So on the results, are you saying possibly yes rather than a firm yes?
Well, at this stage, one can only say a possible yes, because the results we will see, whether with Japan, whether with China, whether with US, whether on issues like NSG, and so on.
Let me put it like this, Mr. Shankar. Do you get the feeling that even if there's a lot of continuity, NSG and the pursuit of NSG is one, the relationship with Bangladesh is another, the broader relationship with the Arab countries is a third, but even if there's continuity with the UP, would you say there is better focus under Mr. Modi? Perhaps clearer conceptualization of what the goals and targets are? Is the analytical back thinking sharper under Mr. Modi, or is that being unfair to Dr. Manmohan Singh?
I think Prime Minister Modi has brought more energy to diplomacy, and certainly a much more personalized touch in terms of building relationships with other world leaders. I would say that there have been some successes, and equally there have been areas where the government has not been so sure-footed. For instance, if you were to take the relationship with Pakistan or China or even Nepal, I think there have been oscillations. You know, you have one day you are hugging, next day you have a terrorist incident.
This is an example of where the conceptualization is actually weak and the focus is blurred.
Yeah, but the successes have been, say, for instance, a far more robust relationship with the U.S., economically engaging China, the land boundary agreement with Bangladesh, and a much better relationship with Sri Lanka, energizing relationships with the Arab world. So there have been successes, and equally I would say there have been areas where the government has not appeared very sure of how it wants to proceed.
As someone who's a student of both the UPA foreign policy, earlier Mr. Vajpayee's foreign policy, and now Mr. Modi's, how do you view the high-profile meetings he holds with NRIs wherever he goes? Now, Ram Madhav on Wednesday told me that these have helped unite NRI communities, because Mr. Madhav claims that they tend to be more divided in terms of religion and caste than the parent community in India. And secondly, Mr. Madhav says this is a conscious attempt at what he calls people democracy. Do you agree with Ram Madhav?
Look, I think the fact that you had the NRIs for so long, and I think it actually goes back to the Vajpayee government actually when it started wooing the NRIs. I think these guys have systematized it, made it much more directly.
Has it become an effective foreign policy tool, or is it something that appeals to the audience at home and boosts TV ratings and perhaps political ratings at home rather than make an impact in foreign policy
No,
terms?
I think ratings won't last too long. I mean, I think the important thing was, look, to give a sense, because I think we treated our NRIs generally, look, those who went as workers, we said, look, this is working class, we don't give much care for them. Those who left who were skilled people, we said, look, this is brain drain. So generally our attitude was one, these guys had to be guilty of something. Now you're telling them, look, you're extension of India. There is a global India today. We need to connect with global India. And I think that's only for...
So they've become a tool for Mr. Modi to effectively carry out his foreign policy in the countries where they're resident.
No, I think that initiative, that you can use the NRIs to deal with the local government, that was done in the nuclear deal. In fact, it was Rajiv Gandhi who actually, first attempt was made under Rajiv Gandhi.
Modi's taken it one step further.
Yeah, but I think the scale of the Indian presence has grown, and also the commitment that today we are making to secure the Indians abroad. Look, the kind of evacuations we've done, you know.
Okay, but that's the flip side of it. There is an opposite view to Professor Raja Mohan's Radha Kumar, and it's the view that's often expressed by people like Shashi Tharoor. He says these NRI meetings can also trespass upon citizens of other countries. And in seeking to use these citizens of other countries, albeit of Indian origin, to influence their governments, you could end up offending the government as well. To what extent do you agree with Shashi Tharoor that this is once again walking a thin, fine rope?
No, I don't agree with Shashi on this one. I think that's a very old-fashioned notion of sovereignty. And the fact is that Prime Minister Modi or the Indian government per se have no interest in using our citizens, our former or Indian origin people to destabilize any government. And that, I don't believe there's a single government in the world that has that fear of this mobilization. Having said that, it's not, if that mobilization was to bring, for example, skilling, investment, and so on to India, it would be very helpful. If that is not being sufficiently harnessed or not showing the results of the scale that they should by now, then that is a question mark for the government to consider. Now, you asked a couple of questions earlier. I think that when you have such an active diplomacy as Mr. Modi has shown, you also need to accompany it each time with one clearly articulated big-ticket policy item that defines then your diplomacy with A or B or C country. And that, I think, is still missing and needs to be worked upon. Otherwise, you do, to some extent, fritter away the gains of these visits.
So in other words, you're suggesting that there's more glamour and potential razzmatazz to the trips than actual substantive outcome.
Well, what I was saying was that most people who engage in this style of diplomacy do carry a big ticket idea with them or a policy that they want to lobby people for. You will have noticed that whether it is with Obama or the various French or European or Merkel, you pick any one leader that does a lot of going around in diplomacy, you'll find that in those visits they will always push, give a spin to, project a big idea.
And that's missing
and a big
here.
item that they want
And
an
you're saying
agreement
that's
on.
missing in Mr. Modi's case.
And in that context, I think that it has not been clearly enough crafted on the visits that we have seen thus far.
Okay.
I hope that it will be more clearly crafted in the visits to come.
Pramit Pal Chaudhary, let me broaden the discussion one step further. Would you accept that Prime Minister Modi's foreign policy travels have not only changed the way foreign governments view him, but also enhanced his profile? One example that comes to mind is that as Chief Minister of Gujarat, he was virtually a pariah in the United States. Now as Prime Minister, he's considered to be a friend of the President.
Yes, absolutely, and I think let me say there have been extraordinarily tangible gains from what his trip is. When the UPA government left office, the combined FDI and FII capital inflows into India had fallen to $11 billion a year. We were heading for a balance of payments crisis because we need at least 4% of our GDP has to become in foreign capital from across the world. And nobody was sending money into India. And when I met Modi's political aides and I said, why is he traveling? And they said the number one reason is he has to restore foreign capital flows into the country or the economy is going to be totaled. And this year, we had $71 billion combined FDI, FII into the country. It's a record flow. Not only that, in terms of FDI greenfield investment, we have overtaken China. This is an enormous accomplishment. And to say that we're going to see things coming in the future, yes, but already we have seen an enormous surge and change in international views on the Indian economy. And Modi's foreign trips have been a crucial part of this. And
Mr. Shankar, the image and impression that one gets of Mr. Modi, not just by his energy, not just by the enormous range of countries that he's visited, the frequency with which he visits them, and the friendship that he seems to have established with a whole range of heads of government, is that foreign policy is his forte.
Yes, surprisingly, because this was not something which was seen as a strength when he came to office, because his experience was in a state government and not in the center. He has surprised everyone with the deftness and speed with which he has moved in this sphere.
Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think there is a sense of pragmatism. I'm tempted to say Gujarati pragmatism, that earlier we were talking about our approach to the Middle East. There was too much of rhetoric, too much of moralism. But if you see the rest of the world, it is transactional. There is some give, there is some take. Actually, you can use the international system to further your goals, which is what every foreign policy is supposed to be. That I think he's taken that, I think, with a great panache, and he's pursuing that. For example, pursuing the China-Japan competition. Today, Japanese have given us a fantastic loan terms to do the Mumbai-Ahmedabad railway corridor. Probably that's going to force the Chinese to give some kind of a similar offer. So I think there are ways in which you can cut the differences, you can do deals and use that to advance India's interests. I think that is the single most important thing that is brought to India's engagement with the world.
Radha Kumar, I want to ask you about Mr. Modi's personality. To what extent has he surprised people very pleasantly by being actually an extremely easy person to get on with, informal, charming, oratorical in his speeches, and clearly someone who's friendly and easy to get on with as far as the Obamas, the Shinzo Abes, the David Camerons, all of them. I mean, he's established a personal link with them. To what extent does personality help? And in his case, he seems to have a fairly winning one, even if sometimes in India we don't recognize it at home.
No, I think, sorry, I'm laughing at your last comment. I think that his that personality plays a huge role. and increasingly so in contemporary diplomacy. And there is no doubt that he has excelled. As I said at the outset, it is not really a question of what Prime Minister Modi is doing. I believe that in most cases, his foreign visits, his style of diplomacy, the priorities that he has put forward both at home and to the international community are priorities that are not only very welcome, but that are the priorities by and large of the voters. Now, having said that, his real problem is implementation. And that's not it's not a question of an individual or a personality. It is a structural, systemic problem that we all need to address.
Absolutely.
And that I believe has been a priority to address also for the past 10 to 15
Absolutely,
years.
but that structural systemic problem you're talking about, in a sense, is something you could call the problem of India. Implementation is not, as a nation, our strong point. But what Mr. Modi has done is to bring not just his personal dynamism and energy, but also a winning personality that makes a big difference when two people sit together and have a chat with each other. A nice, easy to get on with person is someone who convinces you a lot faster than someone who's reticent, taciturn, and not easy to get on with. I think we're going to have to leave it there. We will definitely be following Prime Minister Modi's visit to America when he gets there on the 7th and 8th. We'll observe it very closely. But for tonight, my thanks to all my guests for joining me. And if you have been, thanks for watching. Goodbye. Good night.